Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to address this incredible audience. Like many immigrants, my parents came to this country in search of the American dream. So I'd like to start by focusing on a very simple measure of the strength of the American dream, the odds that a child who starts out in the bottom fifth of the income distribution reaches the top fifth of the income distribution, makes that leap from the bottom to the top. Let's look at that percentage in a few different countries around the world. In the US, the odds that a child who starts out in the bottom fifth reaches the top fifth is 7.5%, compared with 11.7% in Denmark and 13.5% in Canada. Now, some people react to this statistic by saying, even in Canada, it doesn't look like the odds of success are that high, right? Only a 13.5% chance of going from the bottom to the top. Well, you have to remember that, unfortunately, you can't have more than 20% of people in the top 20%, right? And so the maximum value that number can reach is 20%. So the way I think about these numbers is that, in a sense, your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada than in the US. Now, these statistics on comparisons across countries have been the focus of a lot of policy discussion. But what's striking is that upward mobility varies even more across areas, across communities within the United States. And so in recent research that I've done with my colleagues, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the United States using incredible new data, which gives us anonymous information on the earnings of 40 million children and their parents. So what we do is we classify each child based on where they grew up and track them no matter where they live as adults. And what results from this work is this map here, which shows you how upward mobility varies across the United States. So for each of these 740 metro and rural areas, we compute the odds that a child who starts out in the bottom fifth reaches the top fifth of the income distribution. Now you can see the colors in this map are such that lighter areas are areas with greater levels of upward mobility. The lightest colored areas have rates of upward mobility that exceed 16.8%, meaning that nearly 17% of kids who start out in the bottom fifth make that leap all the way to the top fifth. That's a higher level of social mobility than any other country for which we currently have data. Unfortunately, on the other end of the spectrum, in the darkest red colors, you have places where kids who are born in poverty have very low odds of moving up in the income distribution, less than a 5% chance of moving from the bottom to the top, lower than any other developed country for which we have data. Now, you can see the broad patterns in this map, and there's a lot of data here which you can download on the project website if you're interested in studying your own community further. Broadly, the Southeast has much lower levels of mobility than the rest of the country. The Great Plains has very high rates of mobility. Interestingly, however, there's quite a bit of very local variation in this map as well. Let me draw your eyes to Ohio versus Pennsylvania, 2 states that we think of as being roughly similar in terms of their economies and demographics. Yet Pennsylvania has some of the highest rates of upward mobility in the US, while Ohio is extremely low on this metric of social mobility. So naturally, it's also interesting to focus on some of the biggest cities, which are harder to see in the big map. So you can see that rates of upward mobility range from 4.4% in Charlotte, North Carolina, to 10.8% in Salt Lake City, as high as 13% in San Jose. So the natural question is, why does upward mobility vary so much across areas, and what can we do to improve upward mobility throughout the United States? The first clues for us as researchers came from the fact that the spatial variation emerges at very early ages, and in particular, well before kids start to work. So in high mobility areas like Salt Lake City, children from low-income families are much more likely to attend college, and they're much less likely to have a teen pregnancy. So in other words, if I redrew that map looking at outcomes in teenage years, it would look very similar to the map that I showed you where we're measuring incomes when kids are adults. So what that means is that a lot of the factors that are making Salt Lake City and San Jose such upwardly mobile places are things that are affecting children as they're growing up, very consistent with what Secretary Clinton was just talking about. Now, further evidence comes from studying families that move across areas with young children, which is a study we're going to release this summer in which we're analyzing data on 6 million families that moved across areas and looking at what happens when you move to an area with younger children. And the striking fact that emerges is every extra year that you spend in a good environment, your child does commensurately better. So if you move, say, from Charlotte to an area like Salt Lake City, when your kids are very young, so less than 5 years old, you achieve nearly 80% of the gains of the previous residents of Salt Lake City. If you move at later ages, you see a linear decline as you get less and less of the benefit. If you move by the time kids are age 20, you've sort of missed the boat and you get hardly any of the benefit. So that result has two important implications. First, consistent with the theme of CGI, it's important to intervene not just when in the labor market, but at younger ages as well. But second, and very importantly, while the youngest ages matter a lot, there's no reason to give up on children after the age of 5 or 6. We continue to see consistent improvements from being in a better environment at ages 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Every extra year seems to help you. So what are these upward mobility areas doing right? And what might we be able to learn more broadly from their lessons? Now, Secretary Clinton actually already did a great job summarizing some of the key lessons here, but let me review. So the first major factor that we find is strongly correlated with differences in mobility across areas are measures of segregation. In areas where high and low income families are living in close-knit communities, or you have racial integration, you have much higher rates of upward mobility. Another measure of commute times, measure of sprawl. More sprawling cities tend to have much lower levels of upward mobility. Second, income inequality. We find that places with a smaller middle class have much less mobility. And this is very important because some people say, maybe we shouldn't be so concerned about inequality. And to that I say, no, if you're concerned about the American dream, as almost everyone is, you should quite plausibly be concerned about inequality because it seems quite related to social mobility as well. Now, an interesting caveat here is that we find a much stronger correlation with the size of the middle class, but a weaker correlation with measures of upper tail inequality, the fraction of income going to the top 1% in an area. Third, family structure. One of the strongest correlations in the data is that areas with more single parents have much lower levels of upward mobility. Now, a very interesting and important point in interpreting this fact is that you see a strong correlation even if you look at the subset of kids whose own parents are married. So what I mean is, if you take a child whose own parents are married and they grow up in a community with a lot of single parents, they have lower chances of moving up in the income distribution. So that again points to community level factors and not just individual characteristics. Fourth, social capital. This is the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. We find strong correlations with things like religious participation, the extent to which others in your community might be willing to help you out. Now, the idea of social capital was popularized in a book by my colleague Bob Putnam, in a famous book called Bowling Alone, where the title comes from the fact that he uses the number of bowling alleys in an area as a proxy for social capital. And I was actually amazed to find in our data that the number of bowling alleys is in fact highly correlated with rates of upward mobility. But that also is a good caution for people here interested in policy that you want to distinguish between correlation and causation, right? Because I'm pretty sure we don't want to be building more bowling alleys as our solution to improve upward mobility. And finally, as you might expect, we find very strong correlations with school quality. And here, we do think from other research that there are very strong causal effects. And again, we find a consistent pattern that better teachers, for instance, help children at all ages and not just the very earliest ages. So I think investing in the quality of schools and trying to improve the quality of teaching is an area where we can generate very large returns. So let me conclude by talking about a few policy lessons. First, I think it's important to focus on local communities, improving the quality of primary education, as I've stressed, but also focusing specifically on local areas rather than just national interventions. So let's concentrate on Charlotte, Indianapolis, and Atlanta, and not just try to tackle this problem at a national level. Second, Focus on childhood environment in these local communities. Jobs matter, but the ladders to opportunity start well before children begin to work. And third, I think we can harness big data to develop a scientific evidence base for evaluating policies. Many of us are very interested in improving upward mobility and improving the economy, but I think there's a shortage often of careful evaluation to actually figure out what works so that we can spend our limited resources as efficiently as possible. So to facilitate that, our group has posted statistics on social mobility for every county in the United States. And what we're planning to do is work on an automated reporting system with the government where every year, year after year, we'll have these mobility statistics released at the community level. So all of you who are conducting these exciting interventions can then go to this data set and see, am I actually having a measurable impact with the interventions I'm attempting? So let me wrap up by coming back to the statistics that I started out with on how upward mobility varies across areas. You can view these statistics as good news or bad news. The bad news is that on average, disadvantaged children in America have fewer chances to succeed than children in other countries. But what I see in these data are an opportunity and a challenge. I see opportunity because there are areas within America that have greater social mobility than most countries in the world. If we can make each city in America like San Jose or maybe even Dubuque, Iowa, where a remarkable 17% of kids born to the lowest income families reach the top of the US income distribution, we will truly transform American society. The challenge for us researchers is to figure out the recipe for success in cities with high levels of mobility. And the challenge for the policymakers and others here is to act on these findings. Working together, I'm optimistic that we can give every child in America, from Atlanta to San Jose, a great chance of succeeding. Thank you.